Have you ever read a book or a chapter from a book, a page from a book, a paragraph from a book, or even a sentence from a book that was so beautifully written, that was so life changing, that you just stood there and you wonder, how did the author write this? I have, and it led me down a life changing rabbit hole. I read a book just like that, and I went down a rabbit hole. I went and researched on how many of my favorite authors wrote. I researched their writing styles, I researched their explanations, because I wanted to write a book myself. And many of them gave many answers. But the best answer was given by author George R.R. Martin. George R.R. Martin classifies authors into two types: architects and gardeners. Martin says that architects know the plan of the entire house before the first nail is boarded up. He said this in an interview with the Museum of Pop Culture. Now, what does this imply? This implies that architects know every single element of the story before they have even written the first draft. An example, an advantage of this is that architects can push good narratives, moral stories, fables, etc., and they can account for great plot twists. And when talking of plot twists, we have to refer to Dan Brown. Dan Brown is the author for the Robert Langdon series, a series that includes books such as The Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons, and The Lost Symbol. He is an architect, and he plans out a book before he writes it, and this makes for well-made, deeply layered, meticulous plot twists. These plot twists unfold like magic, and when we talk of magic, the only author that comes to mind is J.K. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter series. She, in a blog post, My Story by J.K.R., says that she planned out the entire book series before the first draft of the first book was even complete. Now that we're done with architects, let's move on to gardeners. Gardeners drop a seed into a hole they find out as it grows, is what Martin says. This means that the seed is an idea and the hole is the book. Gardeners plant an idea into their book and they watch as the events of that idea unfold. Unlike architects who tend to write narratives for characters for narratives, gardeners write narratives for characters. And this can lead to increasingly human, complex characters and well-made storyline. A story that starts off simple can evolve into something far, far more complex than it initially started out. And it should come with no surprise that George R.R. Martin himself is a gardener. He is well known for his Song of Ice and Fire series, which is known for its complex characters, plot that keeps dividing and getting better and better, and also for delaying the second last book due to writer's block. And another example of this is Stephen King. Stephen King is a legendary author. He needs no introduction. He has written over 70 books over the course of 50 years. And each of these books is more iconic than the last. His magnum opus is his Dark Tower series, which is hailed as the greatest book series of all time by many fans. Now, if you've read my speaker bio, you should know that Stephen King and George R.R. Martin are my two favorite authors. But then why are they so different? In an interview at the Kiva Auditorium in Albuquerque for one of Stephen King's book tours, George R.R. Martin interviewed him, and he asked him the question of how he wrote so fast. Now, Martin and Stephen King had their responses. Stephen King replied that he was, in fact, writing 6 pages a day, and Martin's replies suggested that he had severe writer's block. But the main reason to this is because Stephen King starts off with an idea and lets it develop naturally. He has nothing planned for his story except the ending, whereas George R.R. Martin has several events planned out for a story, and therefore he has to figure out ways to meet them. But I just said architects and gardeners are two ways of classifying authors. Then why this? Well, this is because the terms should be treated like right-handed and left-handed. When I say I am right-handed, it implies that I predominantly use my right hand. But it doesn't mean I completely reject my left. Similarly, when somebody says they are a gardener, it means that most of their story is unplanned and it revolves as they go. But it doesn't mean that they don't plan anything. They still have to plan the ending. This is because a purely architect author who could not account for any logical block in the middle of his story and therefore would either have to reroute or to erase the story entirely. And a gardener, a pure gardener, would be able to write an increasingly complex story, but he would not be able to provide an ending. And even if he does, would not be able to provide a satisfying ending. Now, how is this relevant in the present scenario? I just talked for around 5 minutes about authors. How many of you read books? Can you please raise your hands? How many of you aspire to be authors? That's very few in comparison to the entire audience. So then, how is it important? Well, we're taking this from the perspective that we are the authors of a book. But when we realize that we are also the authors of our life, we can apply this exact same strategy. The concept of architect and gardener actually mirrors another concept known as planning and flowing. Planners, just like architects, plan out most major events in their life. They know exactly what to do. This could be major events such as going to your education, your board exam results, etc., or something even minor, such as where should we go out to eat tonight? And this leads to them having most of their life planned. However, if something that was unexpected, unplanned for happens, they may have to reroute their entire life, or they may have to change a major element of it. And as much as I'd like to mention some famous personality or historical figure for a planner, the only person that comes to my mind when I think of planners is my mother. Ever since I was born, my mother has planned out almost every single facet of my life. She knows where I had to study, she knows what I had to study, she knows which stream I'd pick, and I was in accordance with this. And this was not only after I was born. Before I was born, my mother had planned out which stream she was going to take, what her career was, that she was going to become a 12th grade teacher. However, even though she planned all of this, the fact that she would become a 12th grade teacher in the UAE, in her words, was unplanned. She never, ever, ever thought it would have happened. Now that we're done with planners, let's go on to flowing, or flowers. Flowers, just like gardeners, go with the flow. They start with a basic goal in their mind. They do not have the way to do it, but they grab every single opportunity they see. And the main difference is, while planners have everything planned out, they can't account for the surprises in their life. Flowers have a lot of surprises in their life. They find surprises on each corner, just like a gardener. And the only example I can have for a flower is my father. Before I was born, my father had one goal in mind. He was going to succeed, and although he did not know the way to do it, he did not account for getting his BBA, and he did not account for coming to the UAE, just like his father. But he did it, and he did end up being successful. But does that mean people are purely planners or flowers? No. People tend to be a mix of both. Even though my dad is a flower, he does plan most of the things in his way later on in his life, as he realized he was going to be a responsible person and that he would turn into my hero later on. And as for my mom, even though she planned most of the things, she decided that not everything could be planned for, and she decided to go with the flow. Now, this story, this TED Talk, went from something that was simple to something complex. It has started as a bookworm explaining why his authors write and how his authors write, to me giving you some life lessons and morals. But just like every gardener, I must find an ending for this. And for this, I'm going to go back to the main question, how do authors write? And I'm going to provide a conclusion for this by quoting John Dufresne and one of his TED Talks back in 2014. John Dufresne says that the very first commandment of writing is to sit yourself down in that chair. And my interpretation of this is that the very first commandment of living is to start.